We stand for opening song. Jesus Christ, risen today, hallelujah. Our triumph is holy name, hallelujah.
on the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the Twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter then said to them, I am going fishing. And they said to him, we will go with you. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, Children, you have no fish, have you? They answered him, No. And he said to them, Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some. And so they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, It is the Lord. And Simon Peter heard it was the Lord. He put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. And when they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, Bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, Come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, Who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. And when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, Feed my lambs. The second time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, Tend my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, Feed my sheep. The Gospel of Christ.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Read and hear and digest your word. Amen. Now this is a mini homily because we have a resurrection story that follows it from one of our parishioners, and I'm so excited for us to get to that too. I love hearing this resurrection story of barbecued fish and bread on the beach. Who doesn't love a great fish fry, especially after a long Canadian winter and a cool spring?
Some of you, like me, may have already enjoyed some of Lake Erie's yellow perch from the first spring fishing excursions on Lake Erie. I enjoyed such a meal with dear parishioners in a wonderful little restaurant in Port Bruce several weeks ago, and then again at Legends more recently. They're memorable for the fish and the people you share food with. In the 50 days of Easter, both the Gospel resurrection stories and the book of Acts give accounts of increasing encounters with the risen Christ, and most often over a meal, which is interesting because food seems to bring out our stories, and in this season, our resurrection stories. Interestingly, encountering the risen Jesus begins with a great unraveling. And let me explain that. Resurrection happens when something sure seems to unravel. And in that space, a great turning to love takes hold of you, and with it, the joy of a new responsibility or an old one revisited in new ways. Today, it's the disciples, and particularly Peter's great unraveling and great turning that we witness. In our first reading from Acts, it's Saul whose vocation unravels so he can find his true one. The disciples fish all night, and they catch nothing. Nothing extraordinary here except that they had left their nets to follow Jesus, and now were returning to what they knew, and clearly business as usual no longer was working. And in the midst of their discouragement and decision to call it a day comes this invitation to cast your nets to the right side of the boat. They protest. There aren't any fish in these waters tonight, and they know they're fishermen. Nonetheless, they try again. Now, I don't know, but this brings me back to parenting. Mom, Dad, I can't do the math. It doesn't work. Okay, now have another go at it. Or, I can't mow the lawn. The lawnmower won't start. Okay, now try again. Well, Thomas doubted and Peter denied, and most of the disciples couldn't see Jesus for trying. Here he was in their midst, on the beach, and alive on our beaches, in our homes, in our churches, hauling us into life as we break bread and go about our daily work and our ministries. The risen Jesus' words to Peter were simple and clear. Jesus does not blame or shame Peter. Jesus does not ask for Peter's repentance. Jesus does not ask 3 times, Peter, do you love me? To remind Peter of his threefold denial and test or trap him. Jesus shows up on that shore, hosts a meal one more time, and tells Peter, I believe in you. I know who you are, and I love you. And yes, you are exactly the disciple I need, the disciple the world needs for God's love to be let loose in this world. And what Jesus unravels often in our lives is our control of everything going our way, which we presume is the best way, to make room for Christ's way that leads us to experience of grace and new life we would otherwise miss. And importantly, will equip us to indeed feed Jesus' lambs, feed his sheep, tend his sheep, as we are doing with our Primates World Relief and Development Fund, and many other ways, and find the joy in doing so from the great turning to his love for us. And so my last 2 sentences are just to remind us before we move to this wonderful resurrection story. You know you fully love someone when what you want is what brings them joy, health, hope, and fullness of life. You want to be part of that, but you don't want your love to get in the way of that. You hope your love will build them up, complete their joy, affirm and enable their living out the fullness of their life and calling. And that is what the resurrection does for us. And that is why it's good to know your stories and proclaim them. Now let us enjoy listening to one. Dave? Oh, yes, okay.
morning. I mean, good morning.
Good morning.
Okay. Hear me? So, my resurrection story. My wife and I, originally from London, have been living in Victoria, British Columbia for many, many years. It was initially a great life. However, we were both tired of the frenetic lifestyle and the workaholics that we had become. We had stopped dating, and romantic gestures were few and far between. Walks by the seashore were in silence, and counseling hadn't gotten us very far. I no longer went to church, other than on special occasions, and my wife never did attend, as she was not religious. Since our children were already adults, we decided to separate and seek an amicable divorce. I'm looking at Rob's screen. What you're looking at, and I'll be brief, is a tiny little house on a tiny little lot in Victoria, and as a realtor, I was thrilled because I was involved in marketing that property, which has more palm trees per square foot on the lot than anywhere else in British Columbia. So I had to show you this picture. We had a very nice home situated on a point, which extended out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So that's where we lived. And our property with palm trees was 1 block from the ocean and the nicest sandy beach in town. The views from the end of the point were with Washington State and snow-covered Mount Baker. You can see by the base of the tree an angel who adorned our front yard for all the years we were there, and I now have it in my little place in London. What I'm telling you is this is not a home one would be prepared to give up on a whim. But we sort of did, because we were both motivated to kickstart our new lives and more agreeable careers. She was going to get an architectural degree, whereas I was not precisely sure what I would do. Having said that, I knew I would only settle on something which would churn my juices. We both closed our businesses down. I was a realtor and she was a general contractor and architectural designer. We also sold our 2 rental properties. She would move to Halifax to study at Dalhousie, and I would move to London to first and foremost establish a deeper and loving relationship with my 2 oldest sons, both from a much earlier marriage. If you're wondering whether I was intimidated by the idea of so many drastic changes all at once, the answer was heck yes. Absolutely, I was intimidated. It had been so long ago that I lived in London, the city was almost alien to me. Yet I had visions. I would find the right church, and I was definitely determined. What you're looking at on the screen now is the U-Haul truck that I rented to move myself. I'm saying goodbye to family in Kamloops. So we sold out. I said my goodbyes to our 2 children in BC, our home and its many memories, my successful career and my partner of almost 30 years, and rented the largest moving truck in the U-Haul fleet. I loaded my car on a transporter trailer, which you can see behind the truck, and set off on a 10-day, 4,500 kilometer trek. I always enjoyed driving, so I viewed the trip as an insightful adventure. No radio, just reflections on where I'd come from, where I was going, and how I would live the remainder of my life. Likewise, in the motel room each night, no television, just thoughts and entries in my journal, which I had maintained for many years. And yes, there were a lot of prayers. In addition to the dreams I was formulating along the way, the trip was indeed inspiring. There were many real-life encounters, but the one I valued most was that of a young oil industry contractor from Brooks, Alberta, who I met in the only Tim Hortons in the area. The Tim's was smack dab along the Trans-Canada Highway, so it was necessary for me to pull my rig over to the shoulder, switch on my four-way flashers, and snatch a coffee. The young man watched as I ran across the highway, and as soon as I entered the Tim's, he pointed to the empty chair at his table. He asked where I was headed, and when I told him, he responded with, "Why on earth would you ever want to leave beautiful beautiful Victoria to live in London, Ontario?" I replied that I could never forsake my relationship with my two oldest sons. At first he stared at me without moving or saying a word, and then as his eyes filled with tears, he pointed to an old man a few seats away and said, "That man over there is my father." He and I come to the same Tim Hortons almost every day, but we never acknowledge each other. In fact, my father hasn't spoken to my brother or me for several years. He went on to tell me the rest of his story, and it broke my heart. Yet it also reinforced my resolve to stay the course with my own plans. Then, following that brief encounter, with permission, I reached out to his father by phone. However, I'm sad to say they never did resolve their differences, and the old man passed away later that year. Well, I finally arrived in London and reunited with my sons. They were happy that I was there to stay. We talked a lot for a few days, and then they went back to doing their own thing. The fact that we truly loved each other and were now only separated by mere minutes was a huge relief for me. Just so you have a little more background, I had remarried when my boys were 7 and 12, and then moved to BC. I can assure you that despite my regular support payments, our phoning each other, writing letters, flights to London, and even my later efforts to bring them to British Columbia, I did not come close to cutting the mustard with them. This was never the man I intended to be. The father to share their trials and accomplishments in real time. And I will never, ever forget the taste of their anguish and their pleadings when I told them I was moving. Now that I was in London, I was even more focused on defining the right path for the rest of my life. The mantra which I had been reciting in the U-Haul was, "Do it now, sweet time unaffected, it does not last forever." Over and over again. Do it now, sweet time unaffected, it does not last forever. So what did I do next? I joined a missionary trip and booked a flight to Nairobi, Kenya. What I didn't know at that time was that I would come back to Canada a significantly changed person. Those were all little girls, except for a couple little guys in the back. This is in one of the largest slums in Nairobi. About 125,000 people. These little children were able to go to school because they lived in the edge of the slums. You go into the bowels of the slums, and it's like a caste system. No school, no nothing. No vehicles can get back. They're just winding little alleyways. And if you're sick, you're sick. And if you're going to die, you just die. That's it. On my return, Small was now utterly beautiful. I no longer struggled with the idea of replacing my older car, which worked perfectly fine, with the newer one. I didn't need to live in any fancy digs. I would never again buy a suit and a tie. I had new appreciation for my years as a member of Rotary International and for my financial contributions to their humanitarian work in Africa. I would even dispense with haircuts. Notice I'm smiling. I bought my small home at the end of the year and took possession on the 23rd of December. Then on Christmas Day I moved in. My sons were both away on holidays, so I didn't have a lot of choices about where to eat or sleep. As I listened to CBC's Christmas Eve service on the radio, I decided the best place I could spend the evening was at London's Men's Mission on York Street. I would spend some time with those who were really alone. The experience was sad, but deeply rewarding, as I cried and laughed with men of all ages and backgrounds. Some were still children themselves, and others admitted that they had children somewhere. Several men knew where their children were, but out of shame for having been prodigal for so many years, did not want their children to know where they were. They were absolutely overwhelmed with embarrassment. Just before midnight, I left a donation with the on-duty manager and drove home. I didn't care that I was going to sleep on a mattress on the floor. All I cared about was how grateful I was to have a home of my own, and for the guidance I believed I was receiving at that very moment. For the messages of assurance that I really was on the right path as a consequence of my faith. I then successfully challenged the Ontario Real Estate exam at Western University. Then I gutted the lower level of my home and built a rental suite. The only problem was there was a slow, undetected leak in the hot water heating system, which resulted in a severe black mold, and pretty much the entire lower area had to be gutted a second time, and the suite rebuilt. However, I knew changes for the better were taking place, and I was excited about the future. All I had to do was keep my head on straight by thinking clearly and effectively, and to continue searching for the right church. But I was presented with a few more bumps on the road. Within a few weeks of moving into my house, moving into my suite, the new tenant had guests over who unknowingly brought their own little friends. And it wasn't long before I had a severe infestation of bed bugs. A month later, I had a stroke while walking down Bond Street in Toronto on a business trip. Then a few days later, I passed out, hit my head on the tile floor in my home, and had a severe seizure. I decided to take some time off, yet stay as active as possible. So, with 3 partners, 2 men, and a wonderful woman, we started a men's group in London called the Destination for Men. Our mandate was to assist any man who wanted to be a better version of themselves, to learn to interact more effectively with other men, women, and children. I also secured a part-time position at the Indigo bookstore in Masonville. Then, oh lucky me, CRA decided to audit my move from BC. And also audit an investment I had made in medical aid to Africa years prior. Both at the same time. I was amazed at how hawk-like their timing was. Having said that, I was tickled pink by how transparent and accurate they found my record keeping. You'll recall I was living alone, and I really needed to continue to focus on staying as positive and active as my body would allow me. So I completed the vegan course, joined a hiking group, and prayed more than ever. The best strategy I used to remain upbeat was whenever I walked by a mirror, in my home or in public, I had to stop in my tracks, smile broadly, and utter out loud, "Hello, you young fellow, you." My second best strategy was to simply and humbly walk in the woods and connect spiritually with all God's beauty which surrounded me. I also made a strategic decision to retool the way I conducted my real estate business in Ontario. By working an absolute maximum of 35 hours a week, I could now afford the time to kickstart a writing career. I had always dabbled in writing, with some part-time business consulting and a complimentary business column in a small Vancouver Weekly. I knew if I applied myself, I could be very happy. So within a year, I completed a 15,000-word graphic novel about the vacuous and thus strained relationship between the little boy and his workaholic father. This effort alone was extremely fulfilling for me, in that I naturally followed the path of speaking and writing publicly about the perilous downsides of severe workaholism and prodigal parenting. Thereafter, I joined the London Writers' Society and to my pleasant surprise became its president. These days, as the vice president of CARP, London and St. Thomas chapter, I still look in the mirror and smile. But now I call myself a Zoomer, which is just a trendy name for an old boomer with zip. Having said all that, 2 years ago, I forgot there were pictures up there. Having said that, 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with follicular lymphoma, which is a form of cancer of the lymph system. One would think this new news might have caused me a bit of concern, but realistically, given the cards I'd already been dealing with, I'm pleased to say that wasn't a shock at all. The real shocker, however, was miraculously coincidental with the cancer diagnosis. I finally found the exact church I was looking for. But what a bummer. I'd have to drive all the way to St. Thomas from London. I didn't know if I could handle all that driving. Since then, my doctors are very pleased with my progress, and they now want to see my face as little as necessary. I have a wonderful close relationship with both ex-wives, and together we love and support our 4 children. In fact, I had both of them, all 4 children, and my grandchildren, at my home for Christmas dinner 2 years ago. I can honestly say, and I mean this, there's not a single person at St. John's who I don't appreciate in some fashion. We laugh and cry together, we pray and taizé together, we study and outreach together, and dine and dance together. People often ask, why am I always taking notes during Ken and Janet's sermons? And my answer is, there's so much to absorb and reflect on. At my age, I can't rely on my memory like I used to. The other reason is that on Sunday evenings, I review every Sunday evening my rough notes from church and transfer what's most meaningful to me into a daily journal for future reference when needed. I majored in psychology in university and then worked in a psychiatric hospital. I spent 6 years in the RCAF. I was also a banker, a marketer, a bartender, a sales trainer, a credit analyst. What the heck's a credit analyst? Who cares? And then traveled considerably. I've lost too many friends to suicide and premature death, but I was there to hold each of my parents as they passed in my arms. This is a tough world, but it's also intensely beautiful and thus very precious. If I didn't have my God to talk to several times a day, I honestly don't know where I'd be. He surprised and supported me so many times when I needed him most. He also let me fail when required. In general terms, the reasons why I was so selective in my search for a church were probably the same for many of you. I wanted a church that was anchored in joy and the highest regard for human life and all life. A church with an appreciation how easy it is for us to become distracted by the mundane. A church with an appreciation of how easy it is to procrastinate, as if we have unlimited time to get our acts together. A church which promotes spontaneity, yet balance in all dimensions of our lives. Thank you so much, all of you, and Count Janet, for accepting me as I am and helping me complete my personal resurrection. If I had my way, I would redo all existing road maps so the Trans-Canada Highway, just like the Circle of Life, commences and then returns to 24th Street, St. Thomas, Ontario. Hallelujah.
He is risen.